Jordan Peterson's one of the big faces that talk about the West would be nothing without the church and religion. And
Ben Shapiro makes this argument too, but Europe went super backward, like super backward, almost all the way back to before the pre-Socratics way of thinking. It's called the Greek miracles. This miraculous confluence of things that became the foundation of a rational society. You've got democracy was developed in ancient Greece. You had like formal mathematics, formal logic, the scientific method, and philosophy, analytical philosophy. Friends like are vexed by this. Like, why is it that it only occurred in ancient Greece of all cultures? Not even Mesopotamia, not Egypt, and not even Rome either, right? Rome just inherited all this stuff. Those two cultures, histories kind of run in parallel chronologically. There's no particular reason. The most advanced technology was the computer. They had micro-geared powered computers. We recovered one. There was in a shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean off of the island of Antikythera, which is in the Greek islands. It ran up 250 years ahead of its creation, so it could actually calculate a date up to 250 years in the future, because the Christians forgot it. In the Middle Ages, when the Renaissance started, they thought Aristotle was the shit because they forgot. They didn't have records of any of the other scientists. They thought Aristotle was the pinnacle of ancient science, and no, he was the beginning, really, of ancient science.
welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today I got returning Dr. Richard Carrier, author of Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, as well as The Scientists in the Early Roman Empire. You can get those on richardcarrier.info. And Richard, how you doing today?
Doing great. Yeah, all things considered. So,
yeah.
Glad to be here talking about my dissertation subject, which is, I don't get to talk about it very often, so I'm quite happy.
Nice. This subject that fascinates me. And oftentimes you hear terms thrown around as the Greek miracle. What exactly is that?
Yeah, it's a term that developed in the 20th century in the field of ancient science, the history of ancient science. And it refers to the fact that there was this confluence of events, like the 6th to the 5th century BC. And in that time, a lot of things happened. I mean, we got democracy was developed in ancient Greece, and this all happened in Greece. So then you had like formal mathematics, the idea of formal logic, and the scientific method, and philosophy, analytical philosophy, were all developed at the same time, right? In this 2nd-century period, mostly in Athens, but there's a few other scattered colonies and Greek city-states that also contributed to this. And so you had this sudden explosion of ideas that kind of became definitive for the Western world ever since, right? They've been incorporated one way or another, and especially during the Enlightenment, they've kind of like rediscovered. But they were lost when the Christians, well, mostly lost, not entirely, but mostly lost when the Christians took over during the Middle Ages. And then you had the Renaissance, right? And then these Greek ideas became popular again. And by the time you get to the Enlightenment, they're reintegrated into our culture, basically. So it's not just merely that there's a fad for it. Now it's our foundation of Western civilization is built on it. And I know like a lot of people want to claim that the Christians did all this. No, it just took them weirdly long time to finally come back to this, is really what happened. But what was it? What are we talking about? And it's this idea of approaching the world rationally. And you think that, like, well, sure, everybody had that, right? I was like, not really. Like, if you look at the
Right.
Most comparable culture at the time, which was China, it has the most economic development, massive empire, very powerful, very advanced technologically. But they did not get any of this stuff. They had philosophy, and they had something resembling analytical philosophy, but they never developed formal logic. They never developed formal mathematics. They never developed the scientific method, nor democracy. So none of those things happened. And the question is why? Like, this is the historians like are vexed by this. Like, why is it that it only occurred in ancient Greece of all cultures? Not even Mesopotamia, not Egypt. What is that? And not even Rome either, right? Rome just inherited all this stuff and did great things with it, but they didn't invent any of it, right? And so that's called the Greek miracle. So this miraculous confluence of things that became the foundation of a rational society. And a lot of people who are big proponents of the Enlightenment and modern, neo-Enlightenment thinking really look back to this event as kind of like foundational. And it doesn't mean they invented everything right out of the gate, but they did invent these basic things that then were developed more by them subsequently, and then by us once we took them back. Basically, we rebuilt our culture on top of these ideas again. And so, yeah, so the question is like, what are some examples of this? And to give you an example of like an important one is this kind of exemplifies the whole distinction, right? Is that we have Thales is the earliest recorded, and we're talking, this is like late 7th century, early 6th century BC. Thales is the earliest recorded scientist. Even the Greeks regarded him as the first scientist, or the first physikos, which means the first natural philosopher. And Thales did certain things. He made some advances in geometry and simple geometry and so on. But his biggest contribution was to realize that the planets and the moon are objects in a system. And so that he was the first to actually explain that the moon's light is light reflected from the sun.
Wow.
And that lunar eclipses are the shadow of the Earth passing across the moon, and that you can predict these things, right, based on the relative positions of the sun, moon, and Earth. And this is, you think that we take that for granted now, but that was kind of a big deal. Like before
Right.
that, it was just they had all these mystical explanations, these mythologies as to why the moon was lit at certain times, and
Right.
the idea of what a lunar eclipse was. No one really had a comprehension. They could like come up with patterns, like arithmetical patterns, to sort of guess when lunar eclipses might occur, but they didn't understand why they occurred. They did, right. So it's this idea of skipping away from mythological explanations. It's not gods and angels and spirits and magic and that kind of stuff, but going to trying to find some sort of like logical, rational, naturalistic explanation for phenomena. And this idea exploded, and so you have lots of these ideas. Democritus is one of the early ones who started thinking, well, what if we imagine that everything that exists and all that exists is just atoms in a void, just little tiny particles and empty space, and then you could explain everything with this theory. Now, that wasn't scientific, right? This wasn't a scientific thing that he was doing, but it was this kind of naturalistic, rational way of like, no dragons, no magic. Like we could actually explain everything with this idea. And of course, they got a lot of things right, because that turns out that actually is roughly how things actually are. Right? There's a
Right.
lot of nuances and complexities to be discovered, but once, so they got certain things right about it as a result. And I have an article for people who are interested on. It's at the Secular Web, by the way, which they're revamping their website now. But the Secular Web, I wrote this article a long time ago on comparing Epicurus to Muhammad, because there's this apologetic and Islamic apologetics that there's all these prescient predictions of modern science in the Quran, right? So they say like, this proves the Quran is miraculous, because how could they know? But in
I did a
reality,
whole
the
video
things,
about this.
yeah, yeah. The reality is like none of the things that they claim are predictions of science are A, even in the Quran, or B, even all that amazing. They were actually things that they inherited from the Greeks. They weren't
Right.
things that they were miraculously inventing. But I compare Epicurus with the Quran, because Epicurus isn't even doing empirical science, and yet he's getting way more predictions of modern science right than the Quran does. And so
Right.
you can show like this shows like just reasoning through, like, well, what if we start from the hypothesis that it's atoms in a void, then how do we explain certain things? And the end result is you're going to get a lot of right hypotheses, like at least in general. And then those ended up being the hypotheses that we like built out a little bit more, specified, and then actually empirically proved later on. So it's just by starting from this premise of it's naturalism, and then use logic, and that's it, right? Then the rest, you actually get some of the foundations of modern scientific ontology. But the big other advance was methodology, and this actually ties into democracy. So this idea that when they had this, there's a whole other story as to why they had democracy, but they started this democratic movement. But now democracy is based on the principle that you can't just force people to do shit. You have to actually convince them.
Right.
And so this developed an entire technology of argumentation, right? So people are trying, you invent rhetoric, you invent propaganda, you invent all of these mechanisms to try and trick people into agreeing with you. And then people invent all of these mechanisms to catch the tricks. So they start identifying fallacies. They started, right? So like
Right.
logic builds out because of this need to persuade people and defend yourself against, disingenuous persuasion. And so that happens. And then, of course, what happens when that happens is that evidence suddenly becomes important, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't just have an authority. You can't appeal to scriptures. You can't appeal to the Pope or the despot, right? You can't appeal to the emperor or the king or whatever as to what's going to be true. You have to argue it. And the only way to argue with people is to start presenting evidence that what you're saying is true. And so you have empiricism. develops out of this. And this leaks over into philosophy and thinking about the world. So you have things like Thales, where you have like he starts with a rational atomistic type, not necessarily atomistic, but this rational naturalistic way of explaining things, and then he tests it empirically, and he's able to confirm, oh yes, if we do the math, if we look where the objects are, we do the geometry, it tracks it. My theory of lunar eclipses and lunar phases actually makes sense, and it's actually confirmed empirically. By the time we get to Aristotle, and I would say Aristotle that's 4th century BC.
Right.
Aristotle is the one who's the first to systematize all this into what we would nowadays call science. There were people doing scientific things before Aristotle. He wasn't the first one, but he's the first one to turn into a systemic pursuit and to make it organized into different fields of study and so on. So he laid the foundations. After him, people advanced even further, and like a lot of Aristotle gets ragged on for coming up with a lot of bad ideas. A lot of those get refuted empirically with his own methods within like 100 or 200 years, right? So people forget that, and I think it's because the Christians forgot it. In the Middle Ages, when the Renaissance started, they thought Aristotle was the shit because they didn't have records of any of the other scientists. They thought Aristotle was the pinnacle of ancient science, and no, he was the beginning, really, of ancient science. But to give an example of that, by the time of Aristotle, he's going through the 6 empirical proofs that converge on why the Earth is a sphere. This is a big deal, all right? They can empirically figure out that the Earth is a sphere, and they're doing it with stellar observations. So where you are on Earth determines the rising and setting times of stars, because if you get further down the globe, certain stars disappear from view, right? Because from your angle of view. So you can actually, where you are on Earth, see the shape of the Earth in the star field, right? You can actually observe this. And then the other, of course, is, the lighthouse effect. Ships go out to sea and they sink below the horizon. Lighthouses sink below the horizon. So you can see the curvature there. And he goes through this whole list. There's actually 6 different convergent evidences for this. And lunar eclipses was one of them. You could actually see the shape of the Earth's shadow on the moon. And no matter what time or where the eclipse is, the shadow is always round, which requires a sphere. Even a disc won't do this. And so there's all of these things that they came up with. Really
Flat Earth debunked right away.
Yeah. And as from then on, actually, right?
Right.
So we know that illiterate people were still flat earthers. We know flat earthism existed, but generally, if you were an educated elite, you were not a flat earther unless you were a loony, and they had those then. So Lactantius is an example. This Christian, basically the author of what became the definitive textbook for Christian education. He was a tutor to Constantine's children, so this is how important and well placed this guy was. He wrote this fundamental treatise on education that became the basis of education, insofar as there was one, in the Latin West. And he was a rabid flat earther, and he has a whole section in this book where he says, there's all these scientists with their evidence trying to prove that the Earth is a sphere, but that would mean that there's upside down people on the other side of it, and that's just ridiculous. So I reject it, and that's his argument, right?
Upside down.
He was an outlier. He was an outlier at his time, but he kind of represents the wind that was coming, right? Like he represents this idea of we kind of went back to where things were in the Middle Ages. We went back to where things were before the pre-Socratics, before Thales, where we had all these like supernatural explanations for things, these sort of mythic, ridiculous explanations for things. No one was doing empirical science anymore. No one was like flat Earth. It wasn't necessarily all popular, but it was more popular than it had been before because they're upside down people. You can't have that. That's the logic, right?
Right.
And so, by the time we get to Columbus, of course, educated people mostly knew the Earth was a sphere. He didn't have to like persuade people of that. He would have had to persuade maybe the crew of his ship, because illiterate lower class people wouldn't have had this education, so they wouldn't know. So there definitely would have been flat earthers in his time, but the educated elite mostly wasn't, despite the loonies that you had like Lactantius, despite their influence.
But this is actually fascinating because when you look at the Earth model from like the Catholic Church perspective, it looks like a flat disc with a dome over it.
Yeah,
like water is they show the firmament, they show the moon.
Yeah, this
is big as the sun, and like
this comes from Genesis. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that becomes normalized after this has all been debunked by scientists of the early Roman Empire, late Greek Empire, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Hellenistic.
Normalized might be being too unfair to the medieval Christians. There were medieval Christians who were savvy to the round Earth theory. But they were living in a wilderness intellectually at that time. So they weren't necessarily the dominant view. And of course, there were fewer of them. Like educated people shrank to almost nothing in the Middle Ages, whereas in the Roman period, we're talking about 5 to 10% of a population that was like 10 times larger. So if you talk raw count of people, millions more people would have been educated and known this stuff than was the case in the Middle Ages. You might have the rare odd scholar who really studies this stuff and oh hey, there's some interesting stuff in here. It says the Earth is round, whereas everybody else around him was like, what, upside down people, man, come on. So that's what happens, right? And so they lose interest for about 1,000 years. They lose interest in doing actual empirical testing to advance the sciences. The Renaissance sort of recovers an interest in doing this, and then within a few hundred years, they actually start doing it again. So that's when you get like the 15th century is when people start actually doing empirical science again, and then of course by the
And then the
17th
Enlightenment.
century, yeah, we have the scientific revolution, and then it explodes and becomes the modern world. But that took a long time, and it shouldn't have. If you took that 1,000 years out, if you just didn't have the Christians, and if the pagans didn't do the same thing, because there was a kind of a loss of faith in empiricism. So you had the Neoplatonists sort of taking over on the pagan side, and they weren't it much better. But if you also got rid of them, and you just kept things going the way they were, we would have had the scientific revolution by 400 or 500 AD, and we'd be about 1,000 years more advanced today than we are.
Man,
So
just thinking about that kind of is mind blowing. Thinking about
right.
I was just talking to Dr. Lawrence Cross like right before this, and he was saying because I used to be one of those people who said, well, what's the harm in filling in the gaps with our own belief system? Just saying, we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, therefore it could be a creator. He said, and he made a good point. He said, because it gets you to stop thinking.
Yep.
Problem solved. Let's go back to our watching this football game or something. But when you say we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, instead of saying it could be God, what it does is it forces you to go out and try to figure it out.
That's right. Yeah. And then you get to this whole problem of persuading people or persuading yourself. You got to use reason. You got to use evidence, right? That's the whole idea, rather than appealing to an authority. That is the fundamental difference, which gets into what I talk about in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. I talk about this a little bit in science education too, but mostly in The Scientist, where I talk about it's not so much. So it's like there's often a false picture of a war between science and religion. This sort of war model where the Catholic Church was burning everything and killing scientists. That's not true. They never did that. They never went out and tried to actively destroy science or to destroy scientists. They just weren't interested, right? That was the problem. They just didn't have any interest in these things, and so they didn't preserve this stuff. The example I give many times, I'm sure people have heard me talk about it before, is the Archimedes Codex. And the last surviving volume of the scientific treatises of Archimedes, 15th century, and monks just scraped the ink off to write hymns to God over it. And it wasn't that they like, oh, we must get rid of Archimedes. It was like, who cares about Archimedes? And you know what I mean? It was that.
Yeah.
We need vellum. We don't have enough sheets of parchment, so let's just scrape this ink off. Who needs it? And then write hymns. And they valued hymns to God more than they valued the scientific work of Archimedes. And it was a disinterest that led to this 1,000-year gap in our progress. And I talk about in my book the three values. There are three fundamental values that you have to have for scientific progress, also technological and social progress as well, but scientific progress especially. And one is empiricism, which we've been talking about, which is this idea that evidence trumps authority, right? So it's evidence, not Pope. Fuck the Pope. Give me evidence. That's the difference, right? It's not scripture. Nope. Evidence. But this is threatening, and we see, and I show like Christian authors finding this threatening. They think that the idea that evidence can trump an authority is anti-God, it's anti-scripture, it's anti-religious authority. So they don't like empiricism. They're not fans of it because it bleeds over into all other spheres of life, just as we saw with ancient Athens and democracy, right? Once you have democracy, it sort of all these empirical methods bleed out into science, into all the other fields of knowledge. Well, that was what had to happen back in that time. But when you're trying to get rid of democracy and you're back to religious theocracy, that's a threat, right? So they know that empiricism is a threat to them because the ideas behind it could bleed out into heresies, into challenging of the church authority on social issues and so on.
Right.
So they're not big on empiricism, not fans of it. The other two values, though, are curiosity. And we take this for granted, but back then I found a lot of literature where the Romans and the Greeks are big fans of curiosity, that it is a moral good. You should be curious. You should let the curiosity drive you to find things, go research stuff, discover things, learn things. Whereas the Christians hated curiosity because they equated it with people who were getting curious about theology and stuff, and then coming up with their own answers, and hence you get heresy again, right? You get heresy, you get
Right.
challenging to the church authority. They hate curiosity, and so I show there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of ancient literature that shows that they were very much against it. Curiosity killed the cat. Curiosity is bad. Curiosity leads to heresy. Don't support curiosity. And then the other is progress. So belief, not only the belief that progress is possible, but belief that it is good, right? So that you have to have both beliefs. And the ancient Greeks and Romans had this belief. They believed in progress. They believed it was possible, and they believed it was good and worth supporting and pursuing. The Christians didn't like this because it meant challenging. If progress means abandoning old things and adopting new ones, right? So that means challenging church authority again. It means challenging established facts. So you find a lot of Christian literature where they're arguing both that progress is impossible. If God didn't want you to know it, he would have told you. Or if God wanted you to know it, he would have told you. And if he didn't tell you, then you're never going to find out. It's just
Or,
conjecture,
or they're saying
right? So
you're eating from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Like that's what
yeah, and not even that, right? Because they're thinking, oh, you wouldn't even learn anything really. You'll just make shit up or
yeah,
whatever, right? So they don't even think it's possible. But
right.
they also don't like it, right? So they don't think it's good, right? So it's not something, if you don't think it's possible, you're obviously not going to pursue it. But also they thought it was threatening in the way that you just mentioned, is this eating of the tree of knowledge notion, that we don't want that. We want things to stay the way they are, and because we like that. And so those are antithetical to science. If you abandon those three values of belief in progress, curiosity, and empiricism, you do not have scientific advancement. And that is what characterizes Christianity in the Middle Ages, is that they abandoned those values. And then when you get to the Renaissance, you see they're being popularized again. People are promoting them again. To do that, they have to argue against a lot of church authorities at the time who didn't like them. So if you read like the early Locks, right, the two authors who span a few centuries, they're continually trying to argue for the reacquisition of these values, and they're arguing. They know they're arguing against the church and arguing against authorities in the church and intellectuals who support Christianity. So they had to fight for it. They couldn't just, hey, great idea, and everybody goes, oh yeah, you're right. Why haven't we even think of that before? No, they had to push back, and it took centuries of pushing back to finally get those back into our culture as foundational elements. So that's the story, right? That's the thing, and we've only discussed right now in this show a few examples, but I could go into more
Yeah,
of what they achieved back then, and then the media was lost.
yeah. Because I was going to mention Jordan Peterson's one of the big faces that talk about how the West would be nothing without the church and religion, and look how great the West is compared to everyone else because of the
Yeah,
church, this, that, and the third. And I used to be one of the people that believed that. I used to hear him say that and say, "Wow, that's
right.
really fascinating."
Yeah.
And that's
Ironically, Ben Shapiro makes this argument too, but yeah, go
it
on. There
seems
are
to
others.
be,
There have been many.
yeah, it
Rodney
seems to be
Stark and
certain
so on.
types of people that like to make this
Yeah,
argument.
yeah,
But when you actually when you actually look into the history, you'll find they were way more advanced before the church, and it seems like they almost went backwards. But like you said, what are some more examples of like
yeah.
what were they discovering back then before the church
Yeah,
started to take
and
over?
with regard to backwards, especially in the West. So people sometimes forget that the empire split in half,
Right.
East and West. So you have like Greece in the Middle East, and then you have Europe. Europe went super backward, like super backward, almost all the way back to before the pre-Socratics way of thinking.
Wow.
Whereas in the East, they kept a lot of the stuff, but it went stale. They didn't do anything with it. They didn't advance it. And the Eastern Empire slowly withered away. It took about another thousand. They were too busy shrinking to do anything significant with the science that they had. But so there was more knowledge in the East than there was in the West. But it literally went backwards in the West. It stagnated in the East, which shows that Christianity, even with differences of wealth, was still the common factor that shut this down. It was disinterest. They weren't interested, basically. The East had more money, so they could preserve this stuff longer. That was basically it. And even that ran out. By the time you get to the 5th century, they're scraping ink off of pages, right? That's how much their decline led
Yeah.
to kind of the same effect, right? The
Yeah.
West it happened much more fast, like much faster.
I was
It
actually just watching.
collapsed.
I was actually just watching a not like a mini documentary on the channel Kings and Generals. I'm trying to think of which pope it was or emperor it was, where the Western actually attacked the Eastern and took all their wealth, and they were explaining how much wealth it actually was. They literally, and their orders were to if any Latins are living in Greece, spare the Latins, kill everyone else, take all their money, take all their gold, melt it all down. And this was a big event. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but maybe
so that could be referring to a number of things. You had the problem of the Muslims also taking over stuff.
right.
And their intellectual mindset switched because they were actually very pro-science for the first 200 years of the Islamic spread. And then they became rabidly anti-scientific. The religious elite basically shut that down. And that happened by the 12th century, the 13th century.
That's when
so once they take over, they took over at the wrong time. They took over when they were anti-scientific rather than when they were pro-scientific. So they missed the opportunity to actually begin the scientific revolution. They could have done it, but they turned their backs on it and they went the other direction. China kind of did a similar thing. There's a book called by Kramer. I can't remember the author's last name, but it's called Uncommon Sense. And he goes into this book about how China became very insular and anti-progress and stuff right after the Han Dynasty. And actually, they were getting super advanced, and then they stagnated for the next 1,000 years from the same thing, the same sort of anti-intellectualism that grew up. And so they also missed the opportunity, all because of this top-down anti-intellectual thought. In their case, it wasn't specifically like religions of their book, but it was still a similar kind of ideology.
Yeah, you know what? Just real quick to just jump in. Right around the same time period, I would say 5th, 6th century BC, you get these thinkers like Pythagoras, Confucius, Lao Tzu, and then like it seems like there was some global.
Yeah, well, not global, just
not
those
global.
two cultures.
Yeah,
but you're right. You're right that the rise of sort of the intellectualism, the sort of new intellectual thought, it bloomed mostly in Greece. But there are similar trends, like you were saying, like Lao Tzu, Confucius, are coming around the same time as the pre-Socratics. You get the most sophisticated philosophers in China are the Han Dynasty, which is right around the time of the Roman Empire.
Sure.
Which is, and this tracks wealth, right? So the Roman Empire, or the Chinese Empire, became extremely wealthy and extremely stable right around the same time that the Roman Empire did. And so you can see the economic and industrial history tracks exactly the sophistication of their intellectual history. And then you can see it in reverse, when the two civilizations make different decisions and go in a different direction. But so it is weird, right? Then that's another explanation. We don't really know why those two cultures' histories kind of run in parallel chronologically. There's no particular reason why that would be. I suspect it's just happenstance. But you're right. You were correct to make that observation.
Yeah. So and then what happens between Pythagoras? I mean, I'm reading Pythagoras he's really kind of very metaphysical and sort of woo woo, with the monad and the transmigration of the soul, basically reincarnation.
Yeah. There's actually a few, right? So there are these transitional figures. They're called the pre-Socratics, or the philosophers before Socrates. And Pythagoras is one, but you also have Heraclitus, and there's a variety of these others that also have these very wooey. So they're straddling the two worlds. They're straddling the sort of mythic way of thinking and the scientific way of thinking.
Right.
So they are this trend. They're a transitional fossil, essentially, right?
Yeah.
and what happens is that what evolves out of them are the Socratics and then the Aristotelians, and then you have the Epicureans and so on. And so you have these trends that build, and they go in the rational direction rather than the mythical direction. So that's why you run into Pythagoras with weird stuff. We're not really even sure Pythagoras existed. He's one of the less certain figures.
Yeah, he's very, very strange life. They make him look like a god, basically.
Oh yeah. It's totally mythical histories and ridiculous stories told about him. But even if he didn't exist, the ideas did. So someone was coming up with them and promoting them. We know that was like a lot of it was going on in the south of Italy, which was a heavily Greek colonized area at the time. This is before the rise of Rome. So there was definitely the ideas were around, and they do fit exactly in that time to the actual figures that we have better evidence for existing. But the shit really explodes after Aristotle, right? So Aristotle is the first to start doing things like he dissects animals. So he's doing physiology and anatomics with actual empirical research, including like even some vivisection research, like dissecting animals while alive to see what's going on inside them while it functions. And
fascinating.
That picks up later to the extent that you get the subsequent Aristotelians after him, like about 100, 200 years after him, Herophilus and Erasistratus, they actually are doing vivisection experiments and actually not only refuted Aristotle's theory that the brain is just a cooling organ and the mind is in the heart. That was Aristotle. They refuted it. No, they said they proved that thought was entirely controlled in the brain because they were tracing. They could tell the difference between motor nerves and sensory nerves. They traced all the nerves that go into the brain. So they go, well, they come out of here and go into there. That's kind of like including the tongue and the mouth, right? So like the speech must come from the brain. But they went beyond that. They actually went to the point where they were actually able, through vivisection of animals, to get to localized brain function. So they can say, well, actually, in this part of the brain, vision is processed. In this part of the brain, sound is processed. And so they were actually able to do localization of function, which is the first neurophysics, right? Of getting that. That's how advanced they were getting with their neuroscience. They hadn't at that point discovered neurons yet, right? They don't have microscopes and so on. But neurons weren't discovered until Freud anyway. So if you think like they were still pretty far advanced at that point. And that's one example in medicine. And then you get into physics, and there's a variety of advances they made in physics. And we already talked about the spherical Earth, how the moon gets its light and gets cast in shadow and all that. But there's also they developed lunar-solar tide theories. So they have fairly early on, I think in Aristotle, they already know the moon controls the tide somehow. But somewhat later, the student of Aristarchus, who was the first proponent of heliocentrism, so Aristarchus is like a century after Aristotle. His student, Seleucus, wrote some treatise that we don't have because the Christians didn't want to preserve it, but we have descriptions of it hundreds of years later. And in that book, he proved mathematically that both the sun and the moon positions determine the tides, which is correct. And as apparently they were experimenting or theorizing universal gravitation. So thinking like, well, it must be a gravity from the sun and gravity from the moon that's pulling the waters and shaping things around. This is some pretty like advanced stuff, right? People don't know that this stuff was going on back then, but that was a thing, right? And so that's pretty sophisticated. And you can go down the list of they first mathematical laws of physics, the laws of refraction. They had laws of buoyancy. They were nailing all kinds of stuff pretty well. There were some areas were neglected, but others were more explored.
How long did it take? Because you said he theorized heliocentrism. How long did it take for people to take that seriously? And did they take it seriously at all at first?
Yeah, so I talk about this in The Scientist in the early Roman Empire. A good way to look at this is look at Seneca. So Seneca wrote a book, his own philosophical encyclopedia of nature called The Natural Questions, multi-volume work. And he has a section on this, and where and so what he represents there is kind of what the general elite view, the general educated view is that, well, there are these two theories. There's a geocentric epicyclic theory, and there is a heliocentric theory. Both theories explain all the phenomena. We haven't come up with any evidence to prove one over the other yet. So the general view was, well, it could be either one. And then you had advocates for either side. So you had the heliocentrists and you had the geocentrists. And the geocentrists, there are actually two camps. There was the dynamic geocentrists who agreed that the Earth spun, but was still at the center of everything. And then you had the static geocentrists who thought that the Earth doesn't even spin; it just stays still. Right? And so there's three camps arguing against each other. By the time we get to the Roman Empire, we know these arguments are still happening, but the Christians were only interested in geocentrism. So they only preserved the best geocentrist treatise, which was Ptolemy, right? Ptolemy is 2nd century AD. But his first book of his, the mathematical syntaxis, his first book is about, this is why I reject heliocentrism, but he knows he has to argue against it. And he has to give empirical arguments against heliocentrism and dynamic geocentrism. So you can tell he's arguing against both camps. Now he's wrong, but he's not wrong in the sense that he's going against established science of his day. To give you an example, he talks about how if the Earth was spinning, then there'd be torrential winds moving at 1,000 miles an hour. It would kill everybody, right? Like so you think, well, okay, that is logical. No one had proved inertia, or that inertia would work on gases on a sphere. There's a lot of steps of science to refute him on that hadn't been made yet. So his reasoning was not irrational. It was sensible within the context of his time. But you want to know what the response was, right? I want to hear what the heliocentrist was they wrote against him, but we don't get to read those treatises. They weren't preserved, so we don't know.
Wow. I wonder what they were. I really do wonder what they were. So what else? Okay, so now you got that. That's when was that exactly when he wrote that?
Ptolemy was writing like 130, 140 AD.
Okay, so now we're talking about that's geocentrism is still popular in that time period.
Correct.
But
Yeah.
somebody theorized heliocentrism. How long before that?
It was a competing theory. So Aristarchus is 300s BC.
Wow.
So he's just after Aristotle. Yeah.
Just shows you how, because like I'm thinking like the church has a good reason to favor geocentrism because hey, we're God's creation. This is the center of everything. It's only for if we're out in the middle of nowhere on the edge of a galaxy on this small little planet that's not even in the middle of a solar system, then we're nothing. Then what's the point?
Yeah. And that wasn't, I know where you're going with that. That wasn't Ptolemy's. Ptolemy gives no religious reasons, no ideological reasons to be a geocentrist. His reasons are entirely scientific. They were just wrong. And that's happened throughout history. You know, scientists will give scientific reasons for things and just be wrong. And I think a lot of it was that he was fascinated by circles and circular motion. And heliocentrism didn't really solve the problem. So, like, for example, Copernicus, you know, people talk about Copernicus as the heliocentrist. The Copernican system is actually less predictively successful than Ptolemy's. So it actually is worse, right? And that's because Copernicus was obsessed with circles. He couldn't get away with circles, but you can't map the actual solar system with circles because it's all ellipses.
Right.
And it's all inconstant velocities. Copernicus hated inconstant velocities. He needed constant velocities, right?
Why is that?
Copernicus was already hung up on all these stupid ideological needs, these aesthetic needs, whereas Ptolemy was already willing to abandon those things. He abandoned perfectly circular motions. He abandoned because he had combined circular motions that led to combined motion that wasn't circular. So his theory of the orbit of the moon is actually almost elliptical. So he wasn't so wrong, which is geocentric, right? The moon does orbit the Earth. So at least that was the one thing he got right? Is the moon is geocentric. But he was willing to have inconstant velocities, and he developed the equal angles, equal angles and equal times. So he had developed this law of planetary motion that explained everything. Later, Kepler turned that into equal areas and equal times with ellipses and solve the problem of planetary motion. So like Ptolemy was halfway there, right? But yeah, so it wasn't ideological reasons. There were no ideological reasons to need Earth to be at the center of everything. And the version that you're talking about actually was another, there was a popular view, especially the Epicureans and other scientists who had a fondness for atomistic philosophy. In the Epicurean system, certainly by the time we get to the Roman Empire, they believed that stars were all distant suns with their own planets.
Wow, they're on
civilizations.
Wow.
Yeah, right. So and they knew that they were super distant, and there was millions and millions and billions and billions of more than you could ever count. And that there are other civilizations with whole other animal biospheres and stuff on these other places. That right. So let's think, and they're just reasoning logically from starting purposes, and they get so close to the truth, right? And that there wasn't any hostility to that idea. No one was like, oh no, we can't have that. If there's any hostility, it's like, well, you don't have any evidence that's true.
So
that'd be like, that would be the only opposition.
So I'm reading Plato. I'm reading Timaeus and his other works, and he's talking about what seems like an older Earth argument. He's talking about civilizations that have came and build up to giant technology and then got a flood or something happened and got wiped out. When did the Earth age become questioned from the church giving it to be what would now be 6,000 at the time, maybe like 5,000?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, let's go back further first, right?
Yeah.
So in Aristotle's day, no one was thinking of a young Earth.
Right.
Everybody was thinking there were only two possibilities. There was an old Earth or an infinite Earth, like Earth has always been here.
Right.
So that was the argument that you had to go against. So Aristotle has an argument against this
because he was one of Plato's students, right?
Correct, and he also he thought Plato was wrong about almost everything. So a lot of what Aristotle did was fix Plato and fix him in the right direction. So we're very grateful for Aristotle.
Interesting.
Plato is kind of like a holdover of the pre-Socratics, where he's still semi-mystical. He's not fully rational. Whereas Aristotle says, no, let's get rid of all that mystical stuff and go full rational. And that's how you get Aristotle out of it. But so Aristotle's argument is that the Earth can't have been here forever, because if it was, all the arts and sciences and all technologies and all societies would have been perfected by now. We would be at the most advanced possible, because
Interesting.
we would have reached the pinnacle of everything ages ago. But we haven't. We're still discovering new sciences. We're just still discovering new things. It's clear civilization's only been around for at most a few thousand years, as best they can track. And so he says, well, how do you account for that? Now, Aristotle's solution was that there's periodic catastrophes that wipe everybody out and we start over. So Aristotle's still working with an infinitely old Earth with periodic catastrophes. That's his solution. But then you get to, but you still have other people, like you mentioning Plato, talking about like, well, maybe there was a beginning. Maybe Plato's got the demiurge. The demiurge creates the Earth. There are a lot of other philosophers who think like, well, it just atoms collapsed together and heaped together and built up, and then presto, Earth. That was like the atomist view, is the Earth formed at a finite time in the past. And that, which is largely correct, right? So there were competing views on this, but everybody agreed it was ancient, super ancient, beyond measurable time as far as they were concerned. And then later, after Aristotle, you get people like Eratosthenes, who's finding seashells on the mountaintops, and he's saying, well, these mountains must have been under the ocean ages ago. And his view was not the flood. He didn't say, oh, there was a huge flood. He says, well, the mountains must move. Like they must, this Earth here must have been lower and it's been pushed up over time, which is correct, right? So
yeah. Plate tectonic,
so
he was onto something.
Right. This is what they're doing. So when you get the Middle Ages, you get the Christians coming in, and now they need the Bible to be true. Now You're talking Bishop Ussher and trying to like do 4004 BC, trying to peg it down to the hour of the day that God created the Earth and stuff, and all based on Scripture. This sort of arbitrary, ridiculous myth that they inherited from the Jews. So yeah, that's where it came from. It came entirely from Scripture. There was never any basis for young Earth.
And what's fascinating about that is because that trapped Judeo-Christian philosophy, because you now have a genealogy that you can trace from Jesus to Adam. So you can argue, you can say, well, they don't have the exact dates. But okay, they don't have the exact dates. You're right. It doesn't say 4,000, 5,000 years ago, but it does have the age of each person when they lived and when they died. So you can, if you're going to say the Big Bang coincides with biblical, with the Bible, then you would have to say, then you don't believe the Bible. Either you believe the Bible and those dates match up to the beginning of the sixth day of creation, or don't believe the Bible and it's all just metaphor. And in that case, you have to take a lot of things back. So they fall into a trap when it comes to that.
This is what fundamentalism is, right? Once you admit that it's allegory and metaphor, or that it's fallible, that it could be wrong about things, now humans could reinterpret the Bible to mean anything they want, and that is a huge threat to fundamentalists. This is why, like, this idea that, well, any human can come along and just make up anything and then claim the Bible says that. And it's like, well, yeah, that's actually true, but for their solution to that is to declare the Bible inerrant and literally true. And so if they do that, like, anyone who denies that is a heretic. Okay, problem solved. Right? That's their take, right? So because they can't have people coming at the Bible with their own interpretations. Now, of course, fundamentalists end up doing this anyway. They have multiple sectarian schisms among them as well, but they're trying to stop that with this irrational biblical inerrancy view. Whereas liberal Christians can get away from that, and so they can actually make progress. And like you're saying, like, fundamentalists always seem stuck in the past, right? They don't seem like they can make progress in the ways that liberal Christians can, because liberal Christians can let go. They can let go of things and reinterpret things and make progress. And so that's the huge difference between conservative and liberal Christianity. Yeah,
and the fundamentalists are forced to descend into conspiracy theories. They have no choice but to say it's all a lie. NASA ain't real. The Earth. They have to.
When you get to the most extreme fundamentalists.
But here's the thing, though. Here's the reason why I'm bringing that up. They're the ones who are correct from the biblical perspective. They're not wrong.
Right.
Assuming the Bible is true.
Yeah, they're not hypocrites. Yeah.
and that's why you see a lot of Muslims are flat earthers now, because in the in the Quran, it says that the earth goes underneath, or the sun goes underneath the earth, and the moon follows the sun. That's in there. So if that's true, if that's the word of God, well, then now you have to make a model that fits that. So now you have to make a flat earth.
Yep. There's the same divide in Islam between an old Earth creationist Islam and an young Earth creationist Islam. The young Earth version is the more popular in the sense that the lower and middle classes are more fond of it, and
Right.
also are the most violent fundamentalists are more
Yes.
fond of it. Whereas the more progressive Muslims are into old Earth creationism, and so you have the same thing going on there that's going on here with the Christians being divided on the same issue.
Yeah. When did we get out of the 6,000-year-old? When did that? Is that like in the Enlightenment era? Or was it before that?
Yes, I don't know exactly when, but you have the early geologists, Linnaeus, I think, and some others are doing what's called stratification. So they're looking at layers of Earth and say, well, here's a flood layer every year, and they were able to get the date of the Earth millions of years in the past, and that you see Thomas Paine talking about it in the 18th century. So that was a going thing around then. It was definitely a scientific revolution, enlightenment thing. And that was what Darwin inherited. So Darwin is already in a milieu where all scientists agree that the Earth is millions of years old, possibly tens of millions of years old. You see Mark Twain writes on this as well, and that's around the same time as Darwin. So yeah, I would say the 17th century is when the idea comes up. And then it becomes pretty much the standard view among intellectuals in the next century, the 18th century. And then by the 19th century, everybody's working with that model. Other than what you get are the fundamentalists in the early 20th century are reacting against this. They're reacting against the fact that they lost the argument in the field of science. And so they decided to just declare themselves fundamentalists. And that's when the anti-scientific position of Christians began.
Yeah.
They had to be against science because that was the only way to cling on to their views.
It's just crazy how they're forced to descend into like conspiracy theory. And you know what I found fascinating is the Hindus with the Kali Yuga cycles were like almost close to guessing the right age of the Earth, but just not. But it's just
I know less about that. I can't comment on.
Yeah, it's just funny how that is. But I want to touch. We have a couple minutes left. I want to touch a little bit about the technology. So from a church perspective, maybe the people on the bottom, like the peasants and the working class from the Roman era, they're probably not. They're focused on getting saved and going to church. But on the top, like the cardinals and the bishops and the popes, they're probably focused on technology for their own gain, probably medicine, trying to live longer.
You would hope, right? Yeah, you would think. Somewhat true. So they saw astronomy for calendrics, for running the calendar, right? And medicine for healing. They saw those two things as useful, but they treated them like scripture. So rather than advance either of them, they just treated Galen as fixed scripture. They treated the other astronomers as fixed scripture, and just used it. So they used the scientific achievements of the Roman Empire, the few that they kept. They lost tons and tons. They used some of it, but they weren't advancing it.
That's fascinating.
And technologically, there was no significant advances in the 1,000-year period we're talking. None. So for about 400, well, let's say from 300 to 1300. So I'd say you start to see new technologies pop up. Well, new is the wrong word. You start to see technologies reoccur around 1100. So you've got about 800 or 900 years of real stagnation in the West.
Now, when you say
even in the East.
Yeah, when you say reoccur, do you mean like there was technology that was lost and brought back?
Let me give you an example. So,
Sure.
And this is a thing. I have a blog on my website at richardcarrier.info where I talk about this as a huge shift in our understanding of history. It used to be claimed that the medieval Christians are the ones who invented water power, right? That they invented the idea of running an industry on water wheels. That's not true. That actually is a recovery of a lost technology. In fact, a lost concept. They went hundreds and hundreds of years with they almost completely lost water tech. The Roman Empire is the peak of this. They had more industrialized water power exploitation than we would see again until like the 15th or 16th century, right? So if you think like it took a while, right, to get it back. But this means that they had water wheels not only grinding their grain, but also sawing wood, sawing marble, doing, and even they had forges. They had automated water-powered forges. So they were exploiting water power very extensively, even including like there's the Barbagal facility is one of the most famous examples. This is a second century capitalist project in the Roman Empire in France, where they set up 32 water wheels. They built it on a slope and they built an aqueduct to bring water to it. So you have this massive flour factory. Basically what they've created, this automated flour factory.
Wow.
That's the kind of technology that was lost. It wouldn't be recovered until like 1100 or about 1000 AD ish, but it was lost for the longest time. The Romans advanced that considerably and they had the science of it too. They understood the physics of why this worked. They had water wheels and water screw mathematics. So they knew how to do this. They had kits. So you could actually buy these things, and like IKEA projects, you'd get them in a box and they'd come out all the parts and they'd all have letters on them. And there'd be an instruction manual for you to assemble your water wheel. Like that's the kind of stuff they were doing.
Yeah, because I know more advanced. I don't know if it was Vespasian or maybe before him, like one of the Caesars had built giant aqueducts that were basically going all the way across the Roman Empire, different city to city, from like large lengths. I'm not sure how long exactly, but
well, actually, that was a Roman thing altogether, right? So the Romans were building aqueducts already from the 1st century BC, and every emperor subsequently built tons of these, and canals too. They dug canals, and canals with locks, so you could have like the Suez Canal, not the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. So you have this with independent locks, so you could actually take ships up water.
Wow.
And they had enclosed aqueducts, which makes water run uphill. So basically, a pipe under pressure. So they had these huge pipes that could run up over mountains, and the water would go up and over the mountain. So they had aqueducts that you could make water run uphill. Like that's what they were doing on a mass scale. And this is how they were able to supply and maintain massive cities, like hugely populated, numerous populated cities. And that had a cascading effect across all technologies and industries. So you had mass production becoming a new thing, like a thing that they were developing, because you had mass populations now to make lamps for, or sell garum to. Garum was the most popular. It's a fish sauce. So it's the most popular condiment of the time.
Wow.
And so we have an example like in Italy of basically a cannery. They didn't have cans, but they would use pots, clay pots, and glass jars. But they had a fishery, so they would have their own, like the ocean would trap, they had their own setup that would trap fish. They'd tidal pool, fish would come in, tide would come out, and the fish would be trapped there, and so they could gather all the fish. The processor was right there. They had a chain bucket system, so they could actually elevate water for the manufacturing process. They made all the pots there, they made all the glass jars there, manufactured everything, and then shipped them out. So this is a massive, basically, cannery operation in Italy, and this is 1st century AD. So this is the kind of things they were doing that kind of got forgotten and then were reinvented after about 1000 AD is when these technologies start to get rediscovered. And so even windmills, like they didn't have, so far as we know, we could be wrong about this, but they didn't have windmills grinding grain, but they had windmills pumping water. So they had that technology, and it was forgotten, and then had to be reinvented 1,000 years later. So or hundreds of years later at best. So that's the kind of thing they were doing. And for people who don't know, I mean, I'm sure if people are watching this and who've seen me talk about this before, the most advanced technology was the computer. They had micro-geared powered computers.
What?
At the time. Yes. So we found one of these actually. There's a lot of literature, like the Greeks and Romans talk about these machines, and no one believed them, right? They thought, that must be just fantasy or something.
Wow.
Or it must be much simpler than it sounds. No, we recovered one. There was in a shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean off of the island of Antikythera, which is in the Greek islands. And it was recovered in the early 20th century, and it's been studied since. And it was all broken up, but we've used computers and reconstructed technology to rebuild it.
I've seen this before, actually.
Right. It's called the Antikythera Mechanism, named after where it was found. And this was made about 120 BC. It sank below the sea in the 80s BC. You know all this because of coin evidence. What's this? Yes, it's all gears. Right, yes. One knob. You turn one knob, and this massive system of gears.
Wow.
Controls a whole number of dials. And then there's an instruction manual on it, and it has all these dial readouts. And the dial readouts do all these things. They reconcile 4 calendars. So you take 4 different types of calendars, and it tells you what date is the same on all the calendars, right? So you can pick a date, and it ran up 250 years ahead of its creation, so it could actually calculate a date up to 250 years in the future. So you could pick a date, and it would show that date in 4 different calendars. And then there were dials that would tell you what zodiac sign each planet would rise in. For them, it was 5 planets. It would
Yeah.
tell you what phase the moon would be in. It would tell you in what zodiac sign the sun would rise in. It would tell you, and it would tell you if the day was possible for a lunar or solar eclipse. So it didn't predict lunar and solar eclipses, but it would tell you that it is possible on this day. So it did all of those things, right? And just turn of a dial, all the gears did all this. Requires micro precise engineering and craftsmanship. Requires really advanced astronomical knowledge and mathematical knowledge. So it shows not only that they could do this, but they did, right? Like someone paid for this. Someone actually made one of these things. And we have so many references in the literature. We know that there were tons of these things. There were lots of them. There wasn't just like one miraculous device. No, these things were all over Italy and Greece and other places. We just lost them all. They were all just like melted down and turned into pots and pans or something. We don't know really what happened to them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've seen demonstrations from this girl, Kaylee, History with Kaylee. I think she's a scholar. I'm not sure. She's a YouTuber. She was showing a ancient building structure that had an air conditioning, but the way it was designed was there was a giant like vent on the top that would take in wind because it's higher up. There's a lot of wind up there, and the wind would get carried through a tunnel and brought to the bottom of the building. It was like a air conditioning system.
This is one I don't know. Do you know what culture that was?
I'm pretty sure it was like Babylonian.
Okay,
I'm pretty sure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
No, I'm that one I've not heard of. I don't know that one. But there was a heating revolution to go on the other side,
Sure.
which is blown glass. You'd think so. The blown glass was invented by Syrian Roman Jews, possibly Jews, we think, but certainly Syrian Romans, in the early 1st century, and then it became an exploding technology. It was super popular. Within 100 or 200 years,
Oh yeah.
there's already a massive glass factory up in Germany. And so they had glass, right? They had the slab glass where you just pour glass into things and you get big giant glass chunks.
Yeah.
So glass existed, but blown glass allows you to make very delicate panes of glass, because you can blow the glass and then you can actually flatten it out, and you can have it's like with a rolling pin or whatever, and you get a really thin pane of glass. So you get window panes, right? And think, okay, well, what's the big deal about window panes? Well, think about this. This is what happened at Roman and Greek bathing houses and stuff. They could have massive walls of these panes of glass, so you get tons of solar heating. The sunlight gets in, but it's closed, so the heat stays in there. So you basically have a huge revolution in cheap heat, basically of solar heating,
Wow.
right? So this was actually a really big deal economically, and all just from learning how to blow glass, right? It's these kinds of things that they were doing back then.
And the last thing I want to ask you about, because you mentioned with that ancient computer, we're talking about the planets.
Yeah.
The 5 planets plus the moon and the sun. What did they think they were? Did they know they were planets? Did they think they were worlds? Did they think there was a deity? What can you take us through that?
I mean, they speak metaphorically of them as deities all the time, but no, the real scientists, if you read Ptolemy, if you read other scientists like him, no, they did believe that they were orbs. So they did think the moon was a giant ball. They had a rough idea of how large they were. Like they had realistic notions of the sizes of these things. Not necessarily spot on sizes, but pretty close. Ptolemy got the size of the moon almost directly right. And the sun he was a little off on, but still they were able to do parallax observations and do the geometry and figure this out. So they had a rough idea of their sizes. And they could only see the up to Saturn, right? So they didn't see the planets beyond yet. You need I can't remember if they saw Neptune or not. I don't think so. I think Saturn was the most distant planet. Yeah, Saturn was the most one. And they did so. And Ptolemy has a treatise where he writes. It's called the Planetary Hypotheses, where it's a treatise where he's talking about, well, what are these things? And he has hypothesizes. And he discusses different theories. And one view is that there are these planets, these other worlds, may or may not have life on them. They were open to either possibility. And his view, there are 2 views. One is that they're just floating around. The other is that they're embedded in giant crystal spheres or crystal bands that you can't see because they're crystal.
Wow.
That move, right? So he proposes both theories. He agrees both are plausible. He kind of himself leans towards the crystal sphere view. Now in the Middle Ages, and that just became gospel. So crystal spheres, it's crystal spheres, people.
Right.
Even though Ptolemy said, "Well, maybe."
Everything
He
gets
didn't say,
frozen.
like, definitely.
Everything gets frozen in time to where it is when the church comes around.
Yeah.
But Galileo actually thought that Saturn's rings were two other bodies. He thought there was three bodies.
Yeah, and as one would, right? Like, because
Right.
if you're looking at it in a telescope with low resolution, it does look like it's got two little people, or two little planets orbiting it. It took better telescopes to actually see the full rings of Saturn. Yeah.
That's fascinating. This has been a really interesting chat, and I'm glad to have you back on. I'm going to do this again.
Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this topic.
Yeah.
And people who want to know more about it on ancient science and technology, my book, The Scientist and the Early Roman Empire, is the one to get, because it just goes into all of this. I have a whole chapter on progress that talks about advances in science and tech.
Yeah, and just go to richardcarrier.info and go to Get Books. It's right there. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.